Welcome to Unpolished by Cult. I'm Kathrin Shaffer. One of the things that happens when we start reading the Bible carefully instead of just skimming familiar passages is that we eventually run into moments that make us pause. Not the verses we've heard 100 times before, not the tidy sections that fit nicely into a sermon outline or devotional thought. I mean, the parts that make us stop and say, wait, did that just really happen? Because the Bible contains scenes that are genuinely unusual. A donkey speaks to a prophet on the road. A prophet is told to act out a symbolic message in ways that would make anyone watching raise an eyebrow. Another prophet buries a belt in the ground and digs it back up later as a visual lesson about corruption. A king consults a medium and ends up hearing from a prophet who had already died. Jesus heals a blind man by spitting in the dirt, and a group of friends tear open a roof to lower someone down into a crowded room. If we're honest, those are not the moments most churches lead with when talking about the Bible. We usually focus on the clearer teachings first, the passages that feel easier to explain, the verses that translate neatly into encouragement or instructions. And there's nothing wrong with that. Those parts are important. But when we spend enough time with Scripture, we start noticing that the Bible does not try very hard to smooth out its own strange edges. It tells the story as it happened. And that story includes moments that feel surprising, symbolic, emotional, and sometimes a little odd. For a long time, many of us quietly learned to skim past those sections. We read them, but we don't linger there. They don't always show up in the highlight reels of Christian teaching, so they sit in the background like strange details we're not quite sure what to do with. But here's something interesting. The weirdness of the Bible is not a weakness in the story. It's actually one of the reasons the story feels real. Because when we look closely, the Bible doesn't read like a polished religious marketing document. It doesn't present faith as a carefully curated series of inspirational moments. Instead, it reads like the long record of God interacting with real human beings in the middle of real history. And real history is rarely tidy. People misunderstand things, nations panic, leaders make poor decisions, prophets speak messages that make people uncomfortable, crowds react emotionally, miracles happen in unexpected ways. God uses methods that nobody would have predicted beforehand. When we allow those details to remain exactly as they are in the text, something surprising happens. Instead of weakening our confidence in Scripture, they make the story feel more grounded, human, more connected to the kind of world we actually live in. Because the Bible isn't trying to present a polished image of spirituality. It's telling the story of what it looks like when God enters the middle of messy, complicated human life. And sometimes that story is a little weird. But the weirdness is part of the truth. So today we're going to talk about that side of the Bible. Not in a cynical way and not to poke fun at the text, but with a kind of curiosity that says maybe these strange moments are actually showing us something important about how God works. Because when we stop trying to sand down the unusual parts of Scripture, we often start seeing the story more clearly. One of the most fascinating things about the Bible is how little effort it makes to tidy up the human side of the story. If someone were trying to invent a religion purely to impress people, they would probably remove a lot of the awkward details that show up in Scripture. They would present the heroes as flawless, the leaders as consistently wise, and the spiritual experiences as orderly and predictable. But the Bible does none of that. Instead, it preserves the story in all its strange, complicated, and sometimes uncomfortable honesty. People argue with God, prophets complain, kings make terrible decisions, entire nations ignore warnings that seem obvious in hindsight. And right in the middle of all of that, God continues to speak and act in ways that are often surprising. Take the story of Balaam and his donkey. It's one of those passages that people remember because it's so unexpected. Balaam is traveling along the road, riding his donkey, focused on his destination. What he doesn't realize is that an angel of the Lord is standing directly in the path ahead. The donkey sees the angel and refuses to continue forward. Balaam becomes frustrated and strikes the animal, trying to force it back onto the road. This happens more than once until the story takes a turn that nobody reading it for the first time expects. The donkey speaks, not in a vision or a symbolic dream. The donkey literally speaks to Balaam and asks why it is being beaten. And the strangest part of the story might be Balaam's reaction. Instead of collapsing in shock, he responds as if the conversation is completely normal. That scene is genuinely unusual. If we were trying to design a religious text that felt polished and predictable, we probably would not include a talking donkey in the narrative. But the Bible simply tells the story as it happened. It doesn't apologize for it, soften it. It records the event and moves forward. And that kind of storytelling appears again and again. Prophets often communicate their messages through symbolic actions that would have looked bizarre to the people watching them. Ezekiel builds a miniature model of a city and stages a siege against it as a prophetic demonstration. Jeremiah buries a linen belt in the ground and later retrieves it to illustrate how something once useful can become ruined. Isaiah walks without clothing for a period of time as a warning to a nation about the consequences of misplaced trust. Those actions were meant to capture attention. In a world where people were surrounded by political tension, national anxiety, and spiritual confusion, words alone sometimes fail to break through the noise. So prophets used dramatic symbolism to force people to notice the message God was sending. And then we arrive in the Gospels, where the ministry of Jesus includes moments that are just as unexpected. There's a scene where friends bring a paralyzed man to Jesus for healing. But the crowd is so large, they cannot get inside the house. It's massive. They cannot get through. So instead of turning back or turning away, they find another solution. They climb onto the roof. They bust a hole in it and lower the man down directly into the room where Jesus is teaching. Imagine sitting there listening to Jesus speak while pieces of the ceiling are falling down above. And a man all of a sudden appears slowly from the ceiling, descending in the middle of the room on a mat. Complete chaos. Unusual. And yet it becomes the setting for one of the most powerful moments in the gospel story. Another time, Jesus heals a blind man in a way that feels completely unconventional. Instead of simply speaking a word of healing, Jesus spits on the ground, mixes the saliva with dirt, forms mud, It spreads the mud over the man's eyes before telling him to wash in a nearby pool. It's an odd method, but the miracle still happens. These moments remind us that the Bible was never trying to present a sanitized version of faith. The story unfolds in real environments with real people, reactions, and sometimes unexpected methods. The presence of these strange details actually strengthen the credibility of the narrative. Because when people invent stories to make themselves look impressive, they usually remove the parts that might raise questions. They polish the narrative. They simplify it. They might remove the awkward moments like a talking donkey or, Jesus spitting in mud. Or, Jeremiah walking around nude for a while. But Scripture keeps them. It keeps the strange details, the emotional reactions, the unusual encounters, the men busting through a ceiling on a mat. And because of that honesty, the story feels less like a carefully constructed myth and more like the record of real events unfolding in a real world. The Bible doesn't pretend that the interactions between God and humanity always look neat. It shows us something far more interesting. It shows us that when God meets people in the middle of their world, the results can sometimes look surprising. When we step back and look at all of those unusual moments together, something interesting begins to emerge. The strange details in Scripture are not random curiosities scattered through the text for entertainment value. They actually tell us something important about the nature of the story itself. The Bible is not presenting a controlled environment where everything unfolds in neat and predictable patterns. But instead, it shows us what happens when the living God interacts with human beings inside the unpredictable world we inhabit. And the truth is, that kind of interaction has never been tidy. Human beings tend to like systems, formulas that promise predictable results. If we do certain things in the right order, we expect the outcome to follow a pattern that makes sense to us. And that mindset slips easily into the way people sometimes think about faith. We quietly assume that if we follow God properly, the story will unfold in a calm, orderly way. We expect spiritual experiences to follow a recognizable pattern. We imagine that God's work will look impressive in ways that are easy to explain. But the Bible consistently refuses to behave like a tidy instruction manual. But instead, it tells the story of a relationship between God and humanity that is dynamic, surprising, and sometimes disruptive to human expectations. God does not limit himself to the patterns people expect him to follow. He works through people who seem unlikely. He speaks in moments that appear ordinary. He performs miracles in ways that catch people off guard. And sometimes he communicates through symbolic actions that make observers wonder what they're seeing. That unpredictability can feel uncomfortable if we're expecting faith to look polished. But when we consider the broader context of Scripture, it begins to make sense. The Bible was written in real historical environments where people faced political turmoil, cultural pressure, and constant uncertainty about their future. In those environments, God did not speak only in quiet philosophical ideas. Sometimes the message needed to interrupt the noise of the world. And interruption rarely looks neat. When a prophet performs a strange symbolic act in the middle of a city, people stop and notice. When Jesus heals someone in a way that defies social expectations, crowds begin asking questions. When a moment unfolds that no one could have predicted beforehand, it breaks the normal pattern of attention and forces people to reconsider what is happening around them. Those moments are not accidents in the story. They are signs that the presence of God disrupts the assumptions people often carry about how life works. One of the reasons the strange detail of Scripture matters so much is that they remind us that God's work cannot be reduced to a simple formula. If the Bible were written like a system designed to guarantee predictable outcomes, people could eventually convince themselves they understood exactly how to control the process. Faith would become less about trusting God and more about mastering a set of religious techniques. But the story we are given does not allow that to happen. Instead, the Bible shows us that God is both consistent in his character and creative in his methods. His justice remains steady. His mercy remains steady. His commitment to redeem and restore remains steady. But the way those purposes unfold in individual moments can look very different depending on the circumstances. Sometimes the message arrives through a prophet speaking directly to a king, and sometimes it arrives through a symbolic act that sparks curiosity. It appears through a miracle that stops people in their tracks. It can unfold through a quiet conversation between Jesus and someone sitting beside a well. The diversity of those moments reflects the diversity of human experience itself. And that brings us back to why the strange parts of the Bible matter for our faith today. When we acknowledge the unusual moments in Scripture, instead of ignoring them, we allow the story to remain as honest as it was originally written. We stop expecting faith to look polished all the time. We recognize that God often works in ways that don't fit neatly into our expectations. That realization can be surprisingly freeing because it reminds us that faith was never meant to be a performance where everything appears orderly and impressive. It is a relationship with a living God who meets people in the middle of real life. Real life includes confusion, emotion, unexpected turns, and moments that don't make immediate sense. And throughout the Bible, God continues to meet people right there. The strange details in Scripture also remind us that the story of faith has always been bigger than the structures people build around it. Churches, traditions, and teaching methods all play important roles in helping people understand the message of the Bible. But the living story of God interacting with humanity cannot be reduced to a perfectly predictable format. God speaks through burning bushes. He sends prophets with messages that challenge entire nations. He walks into villages as a carpenter from Nazareth and begins teaching with authority that surprises religious leaders. He calms storms with a word and raises people from the dead. The story of Scripture is not small. It is expansive, unpredictable, and sometimes wonderfully strange. And instead of weakening the credibility of the Bible, those unusual moments actually reinforce its authenticity. Real history contains surprising details. Real encounters with God do not always unfold according to human expectations. The Bible records those moments honestly instead of editing them into something more comfortable. When we allow the story to remain that honest, something beautiful happens. The Bible begins to feel less like a distant religious artifact and more like a living narrative that continues to speak into our own complicated world. We realize that the same God who worked through unusual moments in Scripture is still capable of working in ways that surprise us today. Not because God enjoys confusion, but because his wisdom is larger than our assumptions. And when we approach Scripture with curiosity, instead of trying to force it into predictable patterns, we often discover that the strange parts of the story are the ones that open our eyes the widest. They remind us that the Bible is not just a collection of familiar sayings. It is the record of a living God who refuses to be reduced to something small and manageable. And that makes the story far more interesting than we sometimes admit. When we step back and look at the Bible honestly, it becomes clear that the story God gave us was never meant to feel sanitized or carefully polished for our comfort. Scripture is full of moments that are surprising, strange, emotional, and deeply human. Talking donkeys, symbolic actions from prophets, miracles that happen in unexpected ways, crowds reacting unpredictably to Jesus as he moved through towns and villages. None of it feels staged. None of it feels curated for appearance. And maybe that's exactly the point. Because if the Bible were trying to impress us with perfection, it would probably remove the messy parts. It would smooth out the unusual moments, present faith as something calm and controlled, where everything unfolds exactly as people expect. But that's not the story we were given. Instead, we were given a story about a living God who steps in the middle of human history and interacts with people exactly where they are. In their confusion, curiosity, in their fear and hope and stubbornness and courage, the Bible shows us a world where God meets real people in real circumstances, and sometimes those moments look strange simply because they are real. And the longer we spend time with Scripture, the more we realize that the strange parts of the story aren't something to hide from or explain away. They are reminders that God's ways are bigger than our expectations. They keep us from shrinking faith into something small and manageable. They invite us to approach the Bible with humility, curiosity, and wonder rather than trying to force every moment into a predictable pattern. And that's part of what we're doing here together. This podcast isn't about smoothing over the difficult or unusual parts of faith. It's about walking honestly through the story God has given us, asking questions, paying attention, not pretending the Bible is smaller or simpler than it actually is. Because when we allow Scripture to remain as rich and surprising as it really is, our faith often becomes deeper instead of weaker. We stop trying to control the story and begin listening to it more carefully. And as this conversation continues to grow, I just want to pause and say thank you. This podcast has now crossed over 2,000 downloads, and the conversations connected to it across social media have reached over more than 100,000 views. That's not just a number. That represents people who are curious about Scripture, people who are wrestling with questions, people who are leaning in to explore faith in an honest way. What's being built here isn't just a podcast. It's a space where people can engage with the Bible thoughtfully, ask real questions, and rediscover the depth of the story God has given us. And that matters. So wherever you're listening from today, thank you for being part of this conversation. If you want to explore more of the resources connected to the show, everything lives in the show notes, including the free 5-day Start Here guide and the other pieces of the ecosystem that are growing alongside this podcast. Thank you for sitting in this conversation with me, and we will talk again soon.